So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to introduce Jean, right? I think I pronounced it Jean. To you, Jean Leroux. And Jean happened to have been one of those journalists who turned, if I may use a terrible word. He is now a research associate with the Digital Forensic Research Lab, with a particular focus on disinformation operations in sub-Saharan Africa. So John is a former lawyer, a former journalist, or maybe I can still claim him as a journalist once in a while, and a forensic investigator for the Public Protector and the Western Cape Provincial Government. I'm saying that he turned because, you know, journalists often rather become academics or maybe PR. But he really fell in love with this digital research stuff and investigations. And then he sort of really left us and went on to the other side to be one of the investigators. But we value his knowledge, we value his way in which he looked at advancing, not just in himself, but coming back from time to time to share his skills with us and understand a little bit more about our profession and how we can do better. So, Jean, please take the platform.
Thank you very much for that, Hopewell. Yeah, I think Hopewell, as you pointed out, I used to be a lawyer with no fancy technical background or IT experience. And I think it just goes to show that if you've got an interest in these kind of things, if you are willing to learn, if you're willing to be curious about, you know, things going on social media, anybody can do these kind of investigations. Everything's based on open source information that's already out there. And if you're curious enough, if you are dedicated enough, you can pick up and do these same kind of investigations. You don't need to be a specific or you don't need to be a specialist in a field, just as long as you've got that interest and that curiosity. I'm quickly going to start sharing my screen. It should be up now. And let's get a pointer up so I can, that's a highlighter, and we'd like the laser pointer. There you go. You can actually see where I'm clicking. So yeah, as pointed out, my name is Jean Leroux. I'm with the Digital Forensic Research Lab. Our main organization is based in Washington, DC. And towards the end of December 2019, they saw it fit to open up an office or a branch, or as we call them, a research unit in sub-Saharan Africa. I'd up until that stage been doing some open source investigations around, you know, things like the Gupta bots, but entirely as a hobby or as kind of a side gig. And once this opened up, it actually gave me the opportunity to do this on a full-time basis, you know, as a career. It's kind of a bit of a step away from traditional journalism because it focuses a lot more on the data and the evidence and the open source evidence, and not as much on sources and speaking to people. So it's kind of complementary to traditional journalism, where you've actually got the human component, you've got the people that you can speak to, which we very, very rarely do. So with that, I'm going to quickly pass in through. That's me within my pre-pandemic days. You can look at some of the research and the work that we do. We've got a global group of individuals working on this. So my colleagues in the Ukraine, for example, see different tactics and different strategies being used. So it's quite often nice to just see what the rest of the world are dealing with. Very often that eventually spills over into our local sphere as well. We saw this with the US elections, where a lot of times the conspiracies would start off in the US, and then about 6 to 7 hours later, we'd start seeing local right-wing communities using those same kind of conspiracies that were rife in the US a few hours before. That's my Twitter handle. I'll be going through a couple of things today, but this is very introductory and very brief as well. So if there's any questions, if you come across something you think might look suspicious, or you'd like me to, perhaps look at something with you, I'll be more than happy to do that. And I'm always so happy to try and assist journalists to, kind of replicate the work we do. It's at the end of the day to everyone's benefit if you can get a handle on misinformation and disinformation. So to start off with, again, it's always the boring stuff, the terminology. Thandi touched a bit on this during her session. But the main kind of distinction we always draw on is the one between disinformation and misinformation. And as Thandi pointed out, the main point of contention between these two is the intention. So with disinformation, there is this deliberate act of spreading the disinformation. And that deliberation, the fact that you are intentionally going out your way to share and propagate this, is what sets it apart from misinformation. I always use the example of my grandmother that would send me this herbal remedy that she saw on some Facebook group. She sent that to me and to all of her friends, in fact, on the basis that it might be something that can help. It's something that she thought would be beneficial to the rest of us. So that would be something that falls under misinformation, because there was no intention on her side in spreading the false information. She thought she was spreading true information, something that might help and assist her friends and her family. However, the company or the individual that created that advert for the herbal remedy in the first place, the company that would benefit through financial reasons for that information being displayed, they would be distributing disinformation. So you've got the same image, the same meme, or the same message, but in the one hand, it's misinformation, and on the other hand, it could be disinformation as well. So it's a good thing to remember that if you can't show that there was a deliberate attempt, there was intent to share the false information, it's important to classify that as misinformation. As researchers, we like to use this, or we always use this technical distinction because it's something that informs what we research. So we'd approach a misinformation investigation differently than a disinformation investigation. And as Thandi pointed out, fake news is kind of the catch-all term that encompasses both of these terms. It's something we shy away from for the reasons that Thandi mentioned. It's a term that's very politicized. It's a term that's not very, very accurate as well, because it's very difficult to try and explain to somebody why some news would be fake and some wouldn't be, and how do you determine what is fake and what not. But in some instances, so depending on your audience, it might be useful to use that in reference to a specific discussion or a specific audience. Even though we shy away from it, we maintain that disinformation and misinformation classification. As a journalist, there might be instances where it could be useful for your audience's sake to use the term fake news. But as long as you understand that it's not an accurate way of referring to it. The last thing that I just want to point out here is the kind of our definition of propaganda. And this is where you use or you distribute any kind of information that's designed to influence an audience for either a political or an ideological benefit of the source of that information, and not for the audience's benefit. So if you're, for example, distributing political information that's supposed to arm voters to better decide who they want to vote for, that would be something that won't be classified as propaganda. But if it's a political party that goes out of its way to share information that could be either true or false, but the aim of that isn't to inform the voter, it's to benefit the political party at the end of the day. So for example, if there's a radio advert of somebody providing a testimonial about how party X, Y, and Z changed their life in this particular ward, if there wasn't any disclosure that advert was being paid for, that would be classified as propaganda. Even though it might be true, their lives might have been changed for the better or for the worse. But the fact that advert was taken out, there was money exchange, and none of that was actually for the benefit of the listeners, that would then classify that as propaganda. So that's who that benefit accrues to is something that's quite important when deciding whether something is actually propaganda or whether it's something that's very actual, truthful, newsworthy reporting. So this issue of intention is kind of paramount. It's something that helps you to distinguish between disinformation and misinformation. And the large part of the work that we do is trying to establish what that intention was. Because we use these open source investigation techniques, taking information that's already out there on the internet, on company databases, on social media, we can have a good idea of what the behavior of specific networks, but we can't always from that determine the intention. If you have enough, if you have a wide enough network, or if you've got enough pages on a website, or if a specific website is old enough, you can often, from the behavior, kind of make a judgment call or get a good idea of what the intent is. And as I indicate here, this is really definitive. So it's often, it gives you an idea, but it isn't something that you necessarily be able to say, this is 100% true. This is what these guys are trying to do through this kind of behavior. So if you've got a fake news website, for example, you can kind of gather from the fact that the behavior of the site shows that it's being monetized. They've got ads running. So from that behavior, you can gather that the intention is to make money. But again, that might not be the only objective. It might not be the primary objective. That'll just be the one that's the most apparent from their behavior. And again, this is made even more tricky because the same piece of information can be disinformation and misinformation. You might find that the same website that you've been looking at was actually, they thought the information they were sharing was truthful. They thought they were helping the people around them. They thought they were actually providing useful information and at the same time making themselves a quick buck. So that's something to keep in mind, is that even when you do find that there's some behavior that could be classified as disinformation, it could also be a form of misinformation if it's the same information. So clicking over to the next section. So when you deal with online accounts and kind of online networks, this is a useful rubric to kind of help you to place where you can find specific networks. And this will apply to individual accounts on Twitter. This could apply to an entire network on Facebook, for example. This could apply to specific networks of accounts on TikTok. It's a very platform agnostic way of kind of framing specific accounts and networks and how they operate. What you've got is you've got this axis, the up and down axis, that gives you the kind of whether it's centralized, so it's being controlled from a single source, or whether it's decentralized and it's lots of individuals performing these actions. And then on the x-axis, you've got the political spectrum on the one hand, and you've got the financial incentive on the other. And this is basically just there's less money involved and more politics. So it's ideology, it's ways of thinking, it's whether you're pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, this will fall under political. And then the flip side is whether there's financial incentives, so whether you're being paid to say these things. And on this side, you are being paid to act in a certain way on social media, and on this side, it's because you truly believe that. And then within these four kind of spectrums, you can be able to place 99% of people acting and interacting online. So, for example, on the extreme of the political and the centralized one, this is where you'll, for example, find state propaganda accounts. If there's a particular political party, for example, that's running a fake account network, you'll find them resorting under here. On the bottom left here, this is where you'll find people that are, for example, anti-vaxxers, people who truly believe that vaccines don't work. They'll resort under here. We saw just yesterday how one of the, I think it's an EWN or an ENCA journalist was trolled because she just reported on SAPRA's findings around vaccine deaths. And most of those accounts that were reporting and almost harassing her would be resorting under here. On the right-hand side here, you'll find like pure rent seekers. These are your influencers, people being paid to tweet particular hashtags or promote certain products. And here in the top right, this is where you kind of get your bot networks. Kind of the Gupta bots would have resorted under here. PR companies and any campaigns they ran. I think that just this week, there was a very interesting thread done by Andrew Fraser, who also does a lot of this research online about insurance companies that was using these fake accounts to promote life insurance products. So this is another case where it's centralized, but there's some financial incentives involved. And you can classify most of the accounts you find online somewhere on the spectrum. They'll find different different depths. So somebody might be more political, or they might be leaning towards somewhere neutral in terms of their politics. Others would be more centralized or less centralized. Maybe some of them are coming from a Facebook group, which would make them slightly more centralized than decentralized. So using this, you can kind of frame where most of these accounts are coming from. And we broadly classify the types of interactions or the types of accounts that you'll find that are suspect or troublesome as one of three. The first one is these troll accounts. These are accounts that are usually real people, and their main goal is to antagonize. So they will approach you on social media, they will target journalists, they will target scientists, and their sole goal is to antagonize that individual to the extent of making them decide, I'm not going to post about this anymore. They try and foment anxiety amongst the individual that's reporting on something. And all of that is just to build up this idea that they are being antagonized. The second kind that you'll find is our accounts that are creating the artificial impression of support. And these are what we call sock puppets. And exactly as the name implies, it's an account that's pretending to be something it's not. It's literally, your hand with a sock over it. These are, for example, the Gupta bots were a very good example of that. Even though they colloquially became known as the Gupta bots, they were in essence sock puppets. They were people running accounts from India, but they pretended to be South Africans. Similarly, you'll find people pretending to be scientists. You could find somebody pretending to be a journalist. You could find clusters of accounts pretending to be South Africans or people staying in Cape Town. There's various sections of the community that can be impersonated by such a sock puppet account. And we'll give you just a few hints a bit later on how you can spot a few of them. Then the last kind of grouping you get is the accounts that are creating artificial amplification. And this is where your bots step in. Bots are very good at amplifying conversations. They are very good at doing retweets or automatically liking specific hashtags. They're not good at having conversations like sock puppets or trolls would have, but they are very good at amplifying narratives. They're very good at amplifying specific tweets. You might find that a troll replied to one of your posts, and then a bunch of bots would then like or share that particular post because that's what they're good at. They're good at amplifying narratives that are already placed there. Now, all three of these, what they've got in common is that they distort the true reality. Either they imply support where there's none, they imply that there's reach, like through amplifying it inauthentically, or they imply that there's antagonism towards a topic where there is none of that. And because they're presented as authentic users, in a lot of cases, it makes it difficult for people to discern whether there's truly support or antagonism for a specific topic on social media. And that kind of polarization is a environment in which disinformation thrives. If there's polarization, it's an absolute breeding ground for disinformation and misinformation. So as I mentioned earlier, trying to attribute who is behind a campaign or who's running a specific account is one of our largest hurdles, because you can't always definitively say that just using open source investigation techniques. Again, we can see the behavior, but we can't always link that behavior with intention. And even when we manage to do that, some of the smarter bad actors do get creative. Something we've seen a lot more recently is the use of franchising, where organizations, or in some cases even foreign governments, would use local actors to conduct their disinformation operations. So this is something we call franchising, and it's literally in some of the recent examples we've seen the Internet Research Agency, which is a Russian-based troll factory, went out and trained, bought equipment, bought cell phones, rented a house in Ghana in order for them to run an Instagram campaign targeting African Americans in the US. So even though the entire operation was being orchestrated from the IRA in Russia, all of the operational side of things happened in Ghana. They were using, local languages. They were using local vernacular in some of the posts. Everything, if you looked at that operation, appeared to be a local operation. It was only once Facebook and Instagram got involved that they actually could determine that the IRA was linked with it. They were the ones supplying email addresses, providing login details, and so on. And just a quick note on this here: if you are writing about any of these things, if you are unsure about attribution, I mean, don't say you're sure that it's irrational or that you think. Be very careful to hedge your language when you're not confident about any of these findings. It's often more useful to say that you don't know something than pretend that you do, and that can be used at a later stage to try and discredit all of the rest of your work. So some of the things that we look for when we try and find inauthentic accounts is to, for example, look at linguistic cues. We rate these kind of from the weakest signals to some of the strongest signals. So some of the weakest things you can find is linguistic cues. And for example, with the Gupta bots, something we found with them was how they would often use a specific denominator, whereas in South Africa, we put a little space between, if we write the number 10,000, there's a little space between the 10 and the 3 zeros of the 1,000. But in India, they don't do it at the 10,000 or the 3-0 mark, they do it at the 4-0 mark. So that was something that we could pick up, is that they kept on, cutting their numbers off at a very strange point. They also used, they're very bad at using vernacular. If you try to address them in a vernacular language, they would just simply ignore you, no matter how much you try and goad them and egg them on. A second thing you could look at is the campaign objectives. So if you can determine what the objective is, you can often try and gather who's running it, who's behind it, who would benefit from this particular campaign. Something that's a bit more stronger than that is if you can determine what the origin is. So, for example, in the Gupta bots' case, we managed to identify that some of the screenshots they were sharing contained Google ads, and these Google ads were for insurance companies based in India. So that was a very good clue that these accounts were, originating from India. They weren't originating from within South Africa. And even better, and a kind of a bolt onto that, is if you can determine the IP address that they're coming from. An example of this was, there was one particular day when all of the GuptaBot accounts were deathly quiet. There was not a peep coming from any of them. And you could actually see on that particular day, for that 6 or 7 hour period, Airtel, which is one of their local internet service providers, didn't have any service. Their foreign internet connection was offline. So during that entire period, that 6 hour period, there was not one single tweet coming from any of the, I think, 60 odd GuptaBot accounts that we were monitoring then. And this is because you could almost determine that from that, the internet service provider in India was down. And then the last thing is just, if you can find a money trail, this is probably the strongest way that you can link or attribute a network, simply because nobody's going to go through the effort of setting up a fake news website and then having someone else benefit and make money from that. People are greedy at heart. People will always try and find ways of benefiting from the actions that they take. So if you can find indications of money trails where people are linked, used through money, that's probably some of the strongest links that you can find between individuals. So something to look out for more recently is the use of AI-generated images for profile pictures. Now, all of these images that I'm showing you now aren't real people. These are actually AI-generated images. The ones that I'm showing you now are relatively dated. I think I took them about last year this time. In the meantime, the algorithms have been updated quite a bit. So there's a lot more ethnic diversity in the faces and the persons that are being used. You also be finding more and more children are being used in AI-generated images like this. But there's small things that you can try and pick out on, on images like this to try and figure out if it's a real picture or not. The first thing that you can always look out for is the background is always blurred. You'll never find a very easily discernible background. You'll also find artifacts like this, which doesn't make a lot of sense, things that appear to be out of place. And then, for example, another thing that you can do is to look for artifacts such as this. Because this is an AI-generated image, the AI doesn't actually discern between what's fabric and what's skin. All it does is it runs a mathematical probability that says if you have an earlobe sitting here, then chances are next to it there will be some cloth from a shirt. But the unfortunate consequence, or the fortunate consequence, is that often you'll find artifacts like these being created. Another thing to look out for, and for example, here is the earlobes. People's earlobes are the same. So if you've got an earlobe like this, and you can check it on yourself as well. If your earlobe flows directly into your chin, it'll be the same on both sides. You won't have one ear having a little cut in, and the other ear having flowing directly into your chin or your jawline. Similarly, the reflections in the eyes, you'll see with these AI-generated images, they'll often have a reflection in one eye that doesn't match up with the reflection of the other eye. That's something else to look out for. In this case, for example, this logo on the cap was changed and edited. And then on women, and especially if there's jewelry involved, you can actually see a lot of times that the jewelry will fuse with their hair. And that's simply because the AI has trouble to distinguish between where hair should start and where the earrings should begin. It's like the algorithm has a bit of trouble doing that. And as a kind of a last resort, if you have a number of these profile pictures and you'd like to check whether there's any, all of them are AI generated or not, if you scale them to the same size, you can actually draw a line through all of their eyes and through the corners of their mouths. So if you line these up in a grid, the eyes and then the corner of the mouths will always line up. It's I don't think I've got in this particular presentation, but you'll be able to see from that, and I'll maybe just add it to this presentation before it gets uploaded to. You'll be able to discern that the corners of the mouths and the eyes themselves actually line up perfectly. And that's a good way if you've got a group of these pictures to be able to discern whether it's simply a network of AI-generated images. So just a quick example of the franchising. I'm just going to try and skip through so I can get through some of the more important stuff before we run out of time. This is a network that Facebook took down in October 2019, which was operating in 8 African countries. The closest to us was Madagascar and Mozambique, but they also targeted the Central African Republic and the DRC. And this was linked to this guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's the Russian oligarch that runs the IRA. And what they were doing is quite simple. They were pretending to be locals. They were running these pro-election pages. Some of them were promoting particular politicians. Some of them were dissing other politicians. But there was a very concerted on-the-ground effort to try and sway elections into the favor of specific individuals and specific politicians. This is the 71 accounts that was linked to that Ghanaian NGO called EBLA. This was a relatively small network at that stage, and it employed 16 Ghanaians that used mobile content, or at least mobile phones, to post content to Instagram. And this is the actual house that they were operating from. What was interesting here was that the individual that was cornered in this as the guy running this is a guy called Seth Wiredu. He actually played in a Russian video, at least a Russian movie that was released in June this year, trying almost romanticizing the role of Russian military instructors in the Central African Republic. And that movie was funded by entities linked back to the same Prigozhin individual I mentioned earlier. So it's very closely interlinked. It's almost blatant in the way that they approach some of these things. Now, when you're looking at a suspected disinformation operation, there's 3 main motivators that we try and classify them as. And the first one is financial, so there's money involved. The second is when there's politics involved, and the last one is just recreational, people doing it for shits and giggles or for just the lol of it. And when it comes to the financial aspect, this is where most of your traditional fake news websites would fall into. So these are guys that are using fake news, are using sensational articles, they're using clickbaits, and just anything they can to get an audience in and then to monetize that audience. They do this either through adverts running on the site. Some of them would, for example, be these days running these podcasts where they'll interview anti-vaccine guests and 5G experts that'll tell you that the radiation is giving everyone COVID. And they would then at the same time ask for donations. Some of these accounts will use the traffic they generate from these kind of activities to do something called domain squatting. So they will register a domain, get as much traffic going to that domain, and then once there's a certain level of traffic, they'll try and sell that. We had a guy that we investigated that registered a website called 4FM and 6FM, because when people typed in 5fm.co.za, they would sometimes accidentally type in 4fm.co.za. And then he'd use all of these farm murders and farm attacks articles and have them, it's something called a redirect, in which if you click on his website, you click on one of his links, it'll take you first to the 4FM website and then through to his website. So it adds a little middle hop, and that middle hop creates the impression that there's a lot of traffic going to 4fm.co.za. And then once there's a sufficient amount of traffic, he then went ahead and tried to sell that 4FM website to basically anyone that's interested in a high volume domain. A last thing that some accounts or some websites do is crypto mining while you're actually on the website. I must be frank, and I haven't seen this in quite a while, but this was part of a website, a fake news website that I investigated while I was still at News 24. That used literally crypto mining in the background. When I first came across the website, I found it strange that there was no adverts running on the site. And it took me about an hour before I realized my laptop's fans were spinning quite loudly. And as I dug a bit deeper, I managed to find in the source code of the website that there was actually a crypto miner going on mining cryptocurrency using my laptop at that stage. So luckily, there's something that's exceptionally rare, but is something to be aware of. As an example of this is something that I'm not sure some of you might recall this Mzansi Stories website. This was eventually linked to a guy that was working for UNISA. And this is one of kind of the most striking or the most heinous kind of ways that this account operated. As you recall, this incident was actually perpetrated by a white guy, Nicholas Ninov. But when shortly after the event, this website published this image of a white girl and a black man along this headline about a 6-year-old girl that was raped in the Dross in Silverton. And this immediately created a massive backlash. So people saying, how could you say this? If this is the way the media tries and portrays black men in society, everybody knows this is a white guy. Why are you showing a picture of a black man? That kind of that racial polarization was exploited here in a way that tried to generate as much traffic as it could for this specific website. So this was eventually linked to an individual working at UNISA. The website was registered in his name. Everybody that went and clicked on this link was taken to his website, and the Google ads that were running there would actually score him some money in his pocket. Examples that you'll also find is political disinformation. So usually when there's no indications of a financial benefit, my first thought is just try and start looking for political motivations. And this is because if there's no adverts or no monetization on the site, your next question should be, but where are they getting their funding from? It costs money to host a website. It takes time to create content and publish stories onto a website. So if there's no adverts running on the site, your question should be, but what's the next question? Well, where are they getting their funding from? A good example of this was the WMC Leaks website. This was created around 2017. Also closely linked to the Gupta bots. This was kind of their main source of news and information, which they would end up taking and then sharing and amplifying across social media networks. It's very rare that you'll find any attributions or bylines on these kind of websites. They would quite often just have things written by a staff reporter or by admin, because the aim isn't proper news or proper content. A lot of it is just trying to get a certain narrative across. In this particular case, we managed to link up the website with the individuals in India, and this became almost most apparent in on their Facebook page, when you could actually see that the site was being run from India, despite saying it was page for South Africans by South Africans. Ironically, it was being run from India. I'm going to skip over these just to get through some of the recreational stuff. These are the recreational things is usually when it's people doing it just to get a kick out of it. When the South African lockdown started, you could actually see that some accounts were using images taken from the US to say that this is happening in Pietermaritzburg. There was no monetary benefit, there's no political benefit in terms of this, but it is something that would give you a kick to see some people share your content. It helps you to go viral. You see people, perhaps even your Twitter handle trending on social media. So this is something that happened last year. We managed to locate this to Jacksonville, Florida, based off of the images and the videos. And again, that's not something that's benefiting everyone, but it's something that gives this particular individual a bit of a kick. And then just as a last thing, this is a marketing campaign. Some of you might recall it, this I Love Eating Russians thing, which also trended quite a lot about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And this turned out to be a marketing campaign that was quite cleverly done by Enterprise, where they got this video of a very angry Russian speaker complaining about South Africans that love eating Russians and how we are kind of celebrating this. And there are these adverts about South Africans loving and saying how much they love to eat Russians. And this turned out to be a very smart marketing campaign from Enterprise. And you could pick up on this if you were looking for it, just off of the way that the hashtags and the short links were being used to kind of track the engagement on these tweets. I think with that, I'm going to leave it there. I'm running a bit out of time, but there will be some time during the Q&A. And as always, I'm more than happy to take questions. And if you'd like to reach out to me on a specific topic, I'll be more than happy to jump in and try and assist. Sorry, Apple, I think I'm a bit over, but back over to you.